Tonight it's my pleasure to introduce to you Kerryn Morrison and Gopi Sundar. They're both here from the International Crane Foundation. This is installment 2 of our series on cranes. Gopi was born in Bangalore in India. He got his PhD from the University of Minnesota and has been with the International Crane Foundation since 2003. So what was it like living in Minnesota? So, how's that ice fishing there, you know? Better than in Bangalore. Kerryn Morrison was born and raised in Johannesburg, South Africa, went to the university in Johannesburg and also in Pretoria, and she has been with the International Crane Foundation since 2005. Just as a reminder, the International Crane Foundation is headquartered in Baraboo, about 27 and a half minutes away, if you drive like a Minnesotan. Okay, Kerryn gets to go first. She's going to talk about cranes, wetlands, and communities. Our contribution to solving global challenges. Please join me in welcoming Kerryn Morrison to Wednesday Night Live.
Great. Thanks, everyone. So I am with the International Crane Foundation, but I've been with cranes for about 22, 23 years now, and started with the Endangered Wildlife Trust in South Africa. And in 2005, ICF, or the International Crane Foundation, and the Endangered Wildlife Trust joined hands and formed a full partnership for work on cranes across Africa. So it's really a partnership effort that we have in Africa for cranes. And I'm going to be chatting today just about some of our projects that are contributing to solving some of those global challenges that we have for people in cranes in the world. So we have 4 species of cranes that are resident in Africa. In other words, they do not migrate out, and all 4 of them are threatened. So we start with the black-crowned crane, and it's in that mustard color, the distribution going from West Africa all the way through to Ethiopia and Sudan. We've got the wattle crane up there in the purple, so we've got isolated populations up in Ethiopia and down in South Africa, and the vast majority of our population is sitting in the south-central floodplains of Africa. The blue crane down here is a near endemic to South Africa. So most of the population is down here in the blue, but we find a very small population, probably only about 25 birds now, up in Namibia. So the vast majority are just found in South Africa. And then finally, the grey-crowned crane, that I'm going to be focusing on quite a bit this evening, is found in the grey areas here. So you find it up across through East Africa, down into Southern Africa. And it is currently classified as endangered. It's the fastest declining crane species in the world. And it's experienced declines of anything up to 80% over the last 25 years. So really just in a very, very steep decline. So a lot of focus on that, and that's what I'm going to speak a lot more on today, a little bit later. But to start, you probably all are aware, cranes are to a greater or lesser extent dependent on wetlands for feeding, for foraging, and for nesting, for roosting. This is the grey-crowned cranes. But we do have 2 species that are less dependent on wetlands, and that's the blue crane. One of them is the blue crane we have in South Africa, and the other one is the demoiselle crane, which migrates into the northern parts of Africa, but is not a breeding bird in Africa itself. So blue cranes, although they're independent of wetlands, so sometimes if there is a wetland available, they will nest in it, but usually you'll find their nests out in open dryland areas and grasslands, and you find them very often in the more arid parts of the country as well. So this is the karoo. But the interesting thing with blue cranes is that you always find them close to a watering point, in this case a windmill or an artificial watering hole or a water trough. So you always find them close to water, although they aren't dependent on it for breeding, or they're not dependent on wetlands for breeding. People also are very dependent on wetlands across Africa. This is subsistence agriculture, which often extends quite far into wetlands. But you also find people gathering resources out of a wetland for making fences, houses, and just general utensils in the home. So there's a lot of harvesting of resources out of a wetland, but they also use it for gathering water. And very often people will walk long distances to get water out of a wetland, where very often the water is a lot cleaner than what they have anywhere else. So people are dependent on wetlands as much as what cranes are. And you therefore find this very close relationship in many instances between cranes and people. And this is wattle cranes with the Kafue lechwe in the background and people, and this is on the Kafue Flats in Zambia. And it's really about this, both cranes and people dependent on wetlands and water, that makes it a really interesting conservation scenario. And how do you get that balance? How do you find the balance between people and cranes on the same wetlands and the same habitats? The frightening thing, though, is that we're losing our wetlands at an alarming rate. And this is a very common scene across East Africa. For example, this is all converted wetlands into either subsistence agriculture, cooperative agriculture, in other words, where small-scale farmers join together in cooperatives, or commercial agriculture. So we're losing wetlands at an alarming rate, predominantly due to agriculture, but also due to things like mining, eucalyptus plantations, draining, and other factors. But agriculture by far is our biggest threat. So when you look at it in terms of cranes and people on the same land, and both very dependent on water and on wetlands, I think there are a lot of people around the world who really would like a world where water is secure, biodiversity abounds, and people live above the poverty line in an equitable manner. But that really is a hard achievement, or a hard goal to achieve around the world. Just before I move on to the next slide, this is an interesting photo. It's one of the few photos we get of all three of South Africa's crane species in one photograph. You'll see in there's the wattle cranes, the blue cranes, and then the grey crown cranes. And this is taken down in KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa. So in order to achieve this sort of goal that I think, or what people would like to see, I'd like to think that a lot of people around the world would like to see a better world for biodiversity and ourselves. There are a number of global conservation agendas that have started arising around the world over the last 2 to 3 decades, and particularly in the last decade. And these are just a couple of them, and I'm not going to go into much detail. But the Convention on Biological Diversity, the Paris Agreement on Climate Change, which was signed, has been signed by many people in the last while, the UN Global Compact, the CEO Water Mandate, the Natural Capital Coalition, and in South Africa we've got the King Report on Governance. And all of these are really looking at encouraging governments, corporates, individuals, and interested people to really take on board the real notion of sustainable development, really looking at trying to find a balance between social, economic, and environmental concerns, and really find a proper balance in that. And I think the most well-known now that are really stepping up, that people are really aware of, are the Sustainable Development Goals. This is a set of 17 goals, and there are 169 targets under this, that were put together by several thousand experts from around the world, just trying to come up with what does sustainability really look like in the world, and really focusing on how do we improve people's lives, how do we make sure we've got biodiversity, and how do we make sure the economics are there to match it. In the Africa program, through the ICF EWT partnership, we contribute to a number of these goals, and I think it really is about looking at how do we meet the global agenda, how do we keep ourselves relevant in a world that's competing regularly for resources, for money, and making sure that we actually are contributing to that sustainable framework that we really need, where both people and cranes can exist on the same land. And what we have here then is, it's about, and I'm going to go into detail in a bit more in one of our projects or one of our regions and how we're trying to address these. It's about looking at addressing poverty, zero hunger, it's good health and well-being, climate action, life below water, which really talks to our wetlands, life on land, which is the biodiversity in our cranes, and partnerships. So I'm going to go into a little bit of detail just on how we're touching on those in some of our projects. So just in general, this is a map that just shows where we have projects at the moment across Africa. So this is just a spread of our projects in Africa. But what I want to do today is focus on our East Africa projects, which is up there in this around Lake Victoria. So this is a map of our core areas for grey-crowned cranes in East Africa. So in other words, these are areas that have significant populations of grey-crowned cranes. They're still viable. They're in rapid decline due to human population growth and the pressures that is causing on wetlands through subsistence agriculture, as I mentioned earlier, the cooperative agriculture and commercial agriculture. Cranes are very threatened in this area due to the very high disturbance levels from people. So with the increased populations in the area and the increased agricultural activities and livestock herding, you're getting a far more people active around wetlands. And it means that cranes are spending more time watching people and livestock than they are actually tending nests and chicks. So the breeding productivity has decreased. And the third major threat is the illegal trade. So it's about taking crane chicks out of the wild for the illegal pet trade. So some of it stays within country, for example, in Rwanda, in Rwanda, where they go into hotels and gardens, but a lot of it is also the international illegal trade, and it's going into captive facilities and the pet trade around the world. So those are our three key drivers behind the decline in grey-crowned cranes in East Africa. There are a number of other threats as well, but those are our three key drivers. So these shaded areas are basically where our core populations of cranes sit. So what I'm going to do is just give you a little bit of an introduction to some of the projects we've got across the region to give you a taste of what we're doing in East Africa. So the first thing that we're really looking at is biodiversity conservation. For us, that's cranes. Very much this is a pair of grey-crowned cranes up in East Africa. So that's ultimately what we're there for. Ultimately, what we want is to have cranes in the area. We want to see them breeding properly. We're wanting to see that decline in the population stop. We want to see that decline halt and actually see an increasing population. So this is really what we're there for. We do monitoring of cranes, looking at breeding success, battling a little bit at the moment to try and figure out how to come up with to figure out what population trends are, because they are just so widespread across a landscape. But we are looking at at breeding productivity as a means of monitoring success in the wild and as a way to monitor the effectiveness of the projects that we've got on the go at the moment. It's about water conservation, and this for us is about wetland conservation. This is a picture taken on the South Kerryn River in southwestern Uganda. Our project coordinator there is Jimmy Mohebwa, and essentially what we have done in this area is, or what we're doing in East Africa is we are setting up a model called conservation agreements. We're using a model called conservation agreements. It's a model that was developed by Conservation International. It's really proved itself in a number of places, and we're now piloting it in our East African projects. And essentially what conservation agreements are is that they are negotiated benefit packages that communities receive in return for conservation action. So the idea behind them is that you negotiate these benefit packages annually, and you draw up a very basic agreement, and then you work with the local communities then commit to certain things. For example, monitoring of cranes, becoming crane custodians, making sure that disturbance levels around crane nesting areas and crane nest sites are reduced during the breeding season. And in return, we then look at benefits that the communities derive. And at the end of every year, we then go back and look at the conservation agreement we all agreed to and signed on. And it's then that we look at whether there have been digressions from that, what hasn't worked, what has worked, and when we enter into a new agreement for the year ahead. And in that way, slowly, hopefully build local community capacity in the benefits that they actually receive, but we also get the conservation benefits. So in this particular case, the communities had their subsistence agriculture right the way down to the river edge. And through these conservation agreements, the communities have agreed to move their subsistence agriculture back 15 meters at least for the first 2 years, which is going to give us a buffer zone of about 30 meters on either side of the river. And it's a starting point, and then we'll go back and we'll renegotiate. But as part of that, we're getting the local communities down into the wetland, and there they are planting papyrus, and just trying to just give the wetland a bit of a boost to get back to its natural state. So it's definitely about looking at how do we restore habitat that has been degraded or lost over time. So it's about water conservation. And then in return, your communities get a number of different benefits. Beekeeping is a great green economy. It's a great way for communities to earn money, to have a bit of to develop their economy further in a way that doesn't threaten the environment in any way. In fact, it benefits it hugely. In Africa, we have a great shortage of our supply is far less than our demand, which means that most of our honey comes in from China, which is completely irradiated. So there's a huge demand for honey. So it's a really good green economy. It's a really good opportunity to work with communities and help them to derive benefits. So we started with our beekeeping at Rugezi Marsh, which is in the northern parts of Rwanda. And essentially one of the key threats to the marsh were the traditional beekeepers who had their traditional hives in the marsh itself. And they would then go in and obviously smoke the bees out, and very often used to cause fires in the marsh. And the marsh is a peatland, which meant it would burn for weeks afterwards. So what we then did is help them to bring themselves together and organize themselves under a cooperative. We helped them to develop a constitution. We gave them basic financial management skills. And we've also provided them now, under the conservation agreements, with beekeeping kits. And that includes anything from proper westernized beehives through to the clothing, the smokers, all of the equipment they actually need. They also get training, they get mentorship, and we provide a market for them on the other side when their honey is ready. So we've had lots of challenges over the last 3 years. Beekeeping is definitely not for the faint-hearted, including the fact that government last year went in and sprayed for armyworms randomly and killed off half our beehives just as they were really starting to take off. So yeah, a lot of challenges, but we're working through them, and we're learning a huge amount out of this project that we can now start taking into some of our other projects, which are looking at beekeeping as well. The second example I've got is Revolving Loans. This is also in Jimmy's area in southwestern Uganda, where the community asked for, through the negotiation process, they actually, excuse me, asked for a revolving loan account to be set up. So essentially, we got the banks on board, we got the local small and medium business enterprise experts in, and again, helped the community to organize themselves into community groups with a steering committee, with a very basic constitution, and gave them basic bookkeeping skills and just explained how revolving loans work. Jimmy sits on the committees of each of these small community groups with these revolving loans. So what happens is a community member from that group will put in a request for a loan, and then they have to say how they're going to pay it back, what it's going to look like, and if it's something that contributes to the green economy and is not detrimental to the environment, they are then given that loan, which they then pay back. And it's amazing the types of records that they are keeping. They are very, very detailed, and we're currently in the process now of evaluating just how well that has worked or not. But just to give you an idea of the gratefulness of these communities, it's really, this is a community, there's very, very high population numbers. It's a real poverty area where we're working. And I was up in Uganda in this area at the beginning of the year, and the leaders of each of the community groups, we've got 3 community groups, so the leaders asked Jimmy and myself if we could please meet at one of the hotels on the one evening I was there. And being a little cautious, I knew it was probably to ask me for money again and to say, look, can you increase the loan amount? And it's a natural thing that happens. But we got there, and to say thank you, they had ordered a full dinner for all of us. And they brought their wives along so that I wouldn't feel left out as the only woman there. So we had the whole families coming, and it was just to say thank you for what we'd done, because we'd really made such an impact in their lives. And I really do think that we're changing lives. It still needs evaluation, but I think we're getting there. Improving well-being, human well-being. This is from our project in Kenya, in the western part of Kenya. When we went to them and said, what will they do, or what do they need in return for conservation action, they really asked if there was any way that we would be able to provide them with clean water. And essentially, people were walking kilometers to fetch water from a well or from a spring, but it was literally a hole in the ground where the cattle and the goats and the sheep all drank. So it was full of mud, full of manure. They were dirty. They were not in good condition, and very often full of mud because of the trampling through. So we've put up these spring source protection structures. They do have taps on them now, but we've put these up in a couple of areas just to trial it. And people who are over 80 years old, it's the first time ever they've actually had clean water to drink. So, I mean, really just change the way that people can go out and actually open a tap and get clean water. They're still walking miles to get there, but at least now they're going back with clean water, and it's not as infected with bacteria and other things as well. So another community that is happy, and we're starting to scale up on that now. And then it's about climate change resiliency. And from our side, it's on two different levels. The first one is around building resiliency in your wetlands, in climatic conditions, building the resilience. And then the second, it's about building resilience within your local communities to changes in climate, to prolonged droughts, to flooding and that sort of thing. This is a picture taken in Rwanda again, where they have a policy at the moment, which we're trying to influence, where they basically are removing peat and they're turning it into power. So it's their peat to power operations. And they're looking at this at quite an extensive scale across Rwanda, which is going to be devastating for their wetlands. But these trenches here are basically draining the peat so that they can go in and harvest and burn it. So what we're really trying to do is really look at the ecosystem services that those wetlands provide to really make sure that the ecosystems are resilient in change. And from the community side, we are now moving a little bit further into how do we build resiliency in communities. And we're starting to look at population health and environment programs. And I'm not sure if you're aware of those, but it's looking about proper family planning. As a basic human right, but also as a way to reduce the population growth that we're seeing in the area. It's about improving the health in general in these areas through vaccinations and general health. It's really about, and then obviously looking at the environment, but from our side to reduce further the pressure on our wetlands is really taking an agricultural approach, looking at climate smart and biodiversity friendly agriculture. And also exploring how we can improve soil fertility in the area. And through these conservation agreements, hopefully get people to reduce their subsistence agricultural encroachment into the wetlands itself. So over time, hopefully, we'll start seeing a little bit more resiliency in communities as well to climate change and to just changes in general within the socioeconomic structure. And then finally, it's about partnerships. We can't do this without partnerships. We partner very closely with in-country NGOs. We partner with local community-based organizations, with local stakeholders, with local government, national government, really just bringing together whichever stakeholders we can so that we all play a part in the puzzle that really needs to be mapped out in order to secure cranes. Which for us has to include people who live on that same land. Very, very few of our grey-crowned cranes actually live or are found inside of protected areas. Most of them live together with people. So we have to find a balance somehow, and it's only through these partnerships that we can really do it. And we have a large number of partnerships across Africa. This is just a small subset, just to give you a bit of an idea. So partnershiping for us is really important, and collaborating and developing the right networks. And yeah, it's about all of the funders who come on board as well. And I think many of our funders are not just funders, but they're actually really key in our projects and what we're actually what we're doing, and are really taking an interest in that. And I think ultimately, as we save a species, secure water resources, alleviate poverty, and improve livelihoods through projects, I believe that we are changing the world. Thank you. Great.
Go ahead and take questions now. That's
Great. Sorry?
Please take questions now.
Okay. Great.
Is the gray-crowned crane the same thing that Ugandans call the crested crane?
Yes.
And can you repeat the question?
Okay. So the grey-crowned crane is the crested crane. That's in Uganda, yeah. Yes.
You mentioned eucalyptus plantations as a problem. The eucalyptus is grown for?
It's grown for a number of things, but at the moment the reason there's the encroachment is that it's grown for electricity poles, so power line poles. So it grows very, very straight, so they're planting a lot of it now as slowly they're electrifying more and more parts of Africa. So that's the key reason. So, great.
Any other questions? If not, go if you want to go, and then we can take questions for both of you when you're done. Here you go. Wow, you didn't even need a telephone booth.
So moving from a situation in Africa, which is more of a situation that we are familiar with in the world of wildlife, which is you're looking to secure pristineness, you're looking to secure a space for the species, and we always view species to, wild species to be things that always are, it is to their detriment when human beings come on the land. And that is sort of the textbooks that I grew up reading, and that's the kind of theory that was drilled into me as I did my master's and then PhD in conservation sciences and stuff. So some of the things that I'm going to showcase to you is to try and bring to you some of the surprises that I got, major jaw-dropping surprises. And it's really opened up a world to us that is, in a way, very positive, but also in another way, it begs questions with regard to how it is that we approach conservation as a whole, and some of the ways that we could still try and view the world as being a happy place despite the huge amount of doom and gloom that all of us encounter every day. And I think some of the examples that we are seeing, particularly in South Asia, with regard to the watbirds, we are viewing this entirely through the lens of a Saras crane, a species that I'll talk about shortly now. But we are also finding out this scenario to be holding for a lot of other species, as these grazing areas and farmlands to being extremely unlikely habitats for waterbirds. So this is our motley crew. We've just begun work in Australia, so we had just one person there. We are hoping to increase it to about 10 by next year. And the rest of the people are villagers that we work with. We have taken a slightly different approach from most of the Crane Foundation work, which is we now train people in the villages that we work in, and we mentor them to become both the monitoring people for us and also the people that we start to train to doing the actual conservation work. And so, as you can imagine, this is a very slow process. So the people that you see on this particular slide represent 6 different languages. So it is a huge challenge when we have to do something like an attitude survey. Or if we want to bring up a proposal where we bring all of them together, then it is a fairly large challenge, because practically all of our staff started to use a laptop for the first time since the Crane Foundation began work there. They did not know about internet except to view naughty pictures. And now they use the internet to send data sets every season. They have learned to use binoculars and spotting scopes as objects that they now view as part of their body. These are now things that are no longer foreign to them, and it's been very exciting trying to use this model, and you will see shortly why we decided to use this model, rather than the usual model that conservationists use, which is try and use English-speaking people, try and have studentships, try and have PhDs, and then try and do conservation interventions, working with the local people, sort of like several projects that Kerryn is doing, but they are also doing things that are very similar to here, which is working directly with people who are on the ground where we want to work. So I want to talk about the ecology of human-modified areas. Very, very different from the scenario that Kerryn pointed out and what many of us here are familiar with, where the population of the whole of the United States is about 240 million. You guys need to catch up. So usually what we talk about when we look at human-modified areas are that generally we don't think of them as wildlife areas. So I work in rice fields largely, and so imagine the surprise of my parents when I said I want to become a wildlife biologist. So they say, see, I told you, you'll never get anywhere. So generally they're regarded not to be suitable for wildlife, especially large species, because those are the first ones to go. And I'm from a country where we have tigers and lions and leopards living alongside human beings, and those are usually the first ones to go when the landscape becomes much more human-dominated than it is truly wild. Second one, the ecology of human-modified areas. In general, if you look at a textbook, apparently you should have the numbers of any species like cranes, especially large birds like cranes. They should start declining over time as the human activity has begun there. Also, the general philosophy, the general principle, and indeed a lot of the data that is coming out nowadays, both from Europe, the United States, and large parts of Africa and Asia, are that intensive agriculture and increasing agriculture and wild birds, not a very good combination at all. So this is sort of the backdrop with which I started my work in 1998, well before I joined the Kerryn Foundation. And the species that brought me into this is the world's tallest flying bird, the sarus cranes. And you can see that there is nothing wild about the area that this species lives in. So the saruses, have a patchy distribution, which makes it an interesting species for ecologists because patchiness is of great importance to try and figure out how big should a patch be, how connected should a patch be for them to persist over time. But that's not what I'll speak about today. Largely, I will focus on the population here in South Asia, which is about supposed to be around 17,000 birds. This is a number that's continually evolving as we start to do work in areas where nobody's really gone in before and done any work. And we've just started work here in Australia as part of my program. For the first time, the Kerryn Foundation will have a long-term program being established in Australia. My colleague Trick in the Kerryn Foundation and his colleagues have been working here for the last 25 years in Southeast Asia, where the numbers are now down to about 500 to 800 birds. But that's not the population that I'll speak about today. Largely, I'll focus on the cranes in South Asia. So South Asia, especially northern India, most of you would have heard about, of course, the most famous thing about India is Agra. So this is very, very close to Agra. And all around Agra, wherever you go, any direction you take your vehicle in, chances are within 10 minutes you'll encounter a sarus crane. And this landscape is extremely rich, very, very fertile, one of the largest floodplain systems in the world, and also one of the oldest agricultural systems in the world. So recently, historians who did excavations and stuff found these old terracotta pots which had been sealed. They broke it open and they found rice that had been harvested 12,000 years ago. So rice cultivation formally, by cultivation we mean not just collecting wild rice, but keeping some rice for the next season so that they can plant it and harvest it again. That's how they define formal cultivation. Goes back to 10 to 12,000 years. And this is an area that not just has rice for such a long time. Today, it has a minimum of 3 crops over the year. Extremely intensive cultivation. A single plot of land yields at least 3 different crops on average, but it's usually up to 5 or 6 crops in a year. That's how heavily the land is used in this particular area. Also, we have a lot of people. So I try not to show this to our HR group in the crane foundation. So how does it compare with Wisconsin? So if we talk about one state, the state of Uttar Pradesh, where we've done a lot of work, and likely we're the only people doing work there outside of the tiger reserves, how does it compare with, say, a state of equal size, which happens to be Wisconsin and Minnesota? And these are the numbers. So Wisconsin, which is similarly sized, has got a population of 5.8 million people, about 40 people per square kilometer on average. In contrast, Uttar Pradesh has the entire population of the United States. And that translates to an average density of 890 people per square kilometer. Don't ask me how we do it, but we've been doing it for centuries. So this leads to a landscape for a species that is absolutely far from being anything but wild. So it's an area where you can almost never see a patch of greenery where you don't have human effort. And most of the landscape there for the last 10,000 years has been converted entirely for human use. So there is nothing wild about the areas. So as conservationists, we need to completely try and flip our minds and try and wrap our minds around this whole location. And that's what we've been trying to do over the last 5 years, trying to figure out if given all of these severe human footprints that we have there, do we have any hope of doing any conservation there? So that's a big question for a small institution like the Crane Foundation, where we want our dollars to go as far as possible. So when I started off, people poo-pooed this work quite a bit. And I'll talk about a couple of assumptions that we explored, and I'll show you what we found out. So, assumption number one, in the 1960s and 70s, the lowland part of Nepal, which used to be a beautiful flooded terai grassland, started to undergo very rapid conversion to rice cultivation. And now it's, since the 70s, it's now progressed quite a bit. It's now also become multi-seasonal crops. They have 2 to 3 crops, much like they do in the Gangetic floodplains of India. And when we started work there, or just before we started work there, everybody wrote to the Crane Foundation saying that most of the stars have disappeared. They are now down to less than 100 birds in the whole of Nepal because there is so much rice cultivation happening. You guys need to come in and start conservation work. That was the kind of stuff that we started to get. Second, this has been going on for a while now. It says that the population growth of people in North India, particularly Uttar Pradesh, is massive, is enormous, is of a scale that is really difficult to imagine for people who come from vast areas like Africa or vast areas like the United States. So the assumption has been, if you look at scientific literature, the assumption has been the saras and the other water birds, surely they must be in trouble. So automatically people have started to designate endangered status to them or vulnerable status to them because they say that this large region of India doesn't have anything wild in it. So surely it cannot have water birds, and therefore the population of these water birds must have shrunk. In short, in a scientific way, if you want to put all of this together, the opinion has been, oh my God. So we started to work here, and this is sort of the map of the South Asian region. We started work in Nepal here, and we are now going to expand across the lowland of Nepal. We also started work in multiple landscapes which have different histories of rice. So we have the Gangetic floodplains here in Uttar Pradesh, where rice cultivation goes back to 10 to 12,000 years. And recently we started work in this area where rice cultivation is just spreading. So, and saras cranes are found in all of these areas, affording us a fantastic opportunity, not just as curious ecologists, but also as conservationists, to try and see how do the saras fare in the older landscapes where rice has been, and are there systems that we should prevent from happening in the areas where rice is coming in now, or vice versa? Are there good things happening there that we need to also bring to these areas where we now have the saras cranes? So how does the situation look like in Nepal? So this is information, and each dot is a pair of saras crane, and each square is a flock of saras cranes. Turns out, in one season, our field assistant counted close to 600 birds. And a lot of the colored dots show you the pairs that managed to raise a chick that particular year. A heck of a lot of pairs in Nepal have been able to raise pairs since we started work there in 3 years. Not only has the population not gone down, it's in fact been the opposite. seems like the population has started to increase, and looks like the increase is not just because birds are coming in from elsewhere. Seems like the increase is also because the birds are able to breed there in a way that would make it appear like this whole of Nepal is a gigantic, healthy wetland system. And we now have scenes like this in Nepal in the mornings. Almost everywhere that you go in lowland Nepal, it's fairly common to find scenes like this where you have breeding pairs and non-breeding flocks flying over the countryside. And now farmers are beginning not to notice that, which is a very, very good sign. When we started working in Nepal, we also started to observe this bird, which some people call ugly, and I sort of agree, the lesser adjutant stork. So this is also a very large stork. It's carnivorous. It's a bird that many people have been talking about very intensively because the populations in Southeast Asia of this particular species is being on a severe decline. So now, if you read today, I picked this up in the morning from a website that talks about the species. It's the up-to-date reference to the species, and it says this species is declining rapidly due to agriculture and human disturbance. So when we started work, there were adjutant stork colonies known from all the blue spots, and we started work here, and guess what? Turns out we have found not just the largest breeding population of adjutant storks anywhere in the world, also turns out that they're breeding like there's no tomorrow. So there are things happening there that is not just occurring on species like the saras, which is an omnivorous bird. So you think that landscapes like farmlands will be good for saruses because they can eat grubs, they can eat the crop, they can eat a bunch of different things. Turns out these areas are also good for carnivorous species, which you would expect would need a heck of a lot of food. And it appears that even a large bird like the adjutants are finding a heck of a lot of food. And they're not nesting in forest areas. They're nesting in trees that are grown for agroforestry by the villagers. They're nesting on sacred trees that are maintained by the villagers in the farmland systems. They're breeding out there and they're nesting right in villages most of the times. So when we want to look at a species, we obviously don't want to bring up anecdotes because sometimes these will become anecdotal that we went to one part in Nepal and we found a good population. We don't want to extrapolate that. So, and also we just don't want to talk about numbers because numbers can be a little bit false because in some seasons they do better and some seasons they don't do so good. And so we wanted to make sure that we have metrics that tell us quite clearly that across the entire range, are the Saras cranes doing well? And one of the metrics that work really well in that regard is how well are they breeding. And breeding metrics are surprisingly very poorly measured for most crane species across the world, including for the sandhills, because it's a very difficult thing to do. It's very easy to count large flocks, but then you don't know how many of the breeding birds have joined flocks. You have all of those problems that go into counting birds. Fortunately for us, the Sarases live in areas which also have reasonably good road network. So that's part of the reason why I'm gaining weight. I'm not getting any field work done. So how does the breeding success of a Saras look in a normal year across the whole area? Because we don't want to look at just one anecdote. And this is how it looks. I'll just walk you through what this means. So this is the overall breeding success map. Blue are the proportion of pairs that did not manage to fledge a chick that year. And the green and red are pairs that managed to fledge 1 or 2 chicks. So cranes are interesting in that they usually lay 2 eggs, but a vast majority of crane species are known to only to be able to raise 1 chick. And many people have offered the explanation that the second egg is sort of like an insurance. And so the Saras cranes in South Asia not only have the highest breeding success of any crane species anywhere in the world, but a hell of a lot of them manage to raise 2 chicks in all of the places that we are studying. There are some places that need work, and it's studies like this and careful monitoring like this that really helps us because we can figure out which places need our attention immediately and which places may not need our immediate attention, but just need for us to keep a watch out. So like in Nepal, where we looked at the adjutant stork, in central India and northern India, we started to look at a species known as the woolly neck stork. And this one has been the most fascinating thing where people have actually disbelieved when we sent in our data for publications. And this is the reason why. So one of the classical descriptions of the woolly neck stork that has been described by a global expert of storks, and I'll read it for you. In India, we've generally seen this stock in secluded forest glades and often hidden by tall marshland reeds that surround small muddy pools. Observation proved extremely difficult, if for no other reason than such habitat is the preferred resting place of the tiger, which itself discourages steering. This is in the early 90s. It's not very old. It's written in a very nice classical British language, but it's the 90s. To give you an example of the most populated area in India where there are really no trees, the birds are just not reading up. They are not reading the same textbooks that we are writing for us. No tigers, no forests, no secluded areas, and it's not just one or two pairs, but hundreds of birds out in the landscape using areas that are not just heavily cultivated, but also have hundreds of thousands of human beings on the landscape. So this sort of leads us to something that we've been trying to grapple with in addition to figuring out, so what do we need to do, which I'll come to hopefully in the question stage, but we've been trying to figure out how to grapple with this huge amount of information that we are getting. And it's something that I'm beginning to call stop doing OMG type of assumptions. And it's been a little difficult to do this because admittedly, these kind of examples of landscapes seem to be rare. They are not definitely going to be cropping up in many places of the world. They are going to be very likely extremely rare. But in a place like India, in a place like Australia, where we do have these fantastic numbers living alongside people, what it has done is it can lead to beliefs that populations are declining. And this, as all of you know, especially some of you who are used to signing checks for things like the whooping crane, your first impact when you're signing your check is, which is the most endangered species? Let's sign a check for that, because that's the species that needs help. And this kind of stuff is beginning to do misallocation of resources, particularly in large, vast areas like South Asia. And so what we are trying to tell ecologists back with our data is please check before we check out. This leads us to the expensive conservation interventions. Remember the plea that we got from Nepal, and we got it from many, many people who were supposedly experts of cranes and stuff, and they had not been able to get into the field for the last 10 years or so. So they were speaking from experience about 10 to 15 years ago, which means that the crane populations have increased within a fairly short period of time. And that's something spectacular, and we want to look into it and try and figure out how this happened. So this can lead to not just wasting of your dollars and our dollars, but also a huge amount of effort, which for a small organization like the Crane Foundation can be completely stifling, because we have 3 or 4 people in each region, and if we start to allocate those 3 or 4 people in the wrong area, then we won't achieve our mission. Also now, with this humongous amount of information that we have from here, from Australia, from a couple of other areas in Southeast Asia like Myanmar, which happily is giving us very, very similar scenarios, we are now pushing to redefine things like human disturbance. Is it constant? It may not be really constant, especially in areas which have experienced human intervention for a very long time, admittedly with the caveat that these humans here in this area are largely Hindu. So while there is hunting, while there is meat eating, they also have natural religious beliefs that we see prevent them from doing large-scale hunting that you would see in an area like, say, the United States, or you would see in a place like, say, Russia, or even Europe, where hunting is a very popular culture of the people, whereas here, hunting, it's quite the contrary. We've had quite a few problems trying to study cranes. For example, there was once when I walked into a wetland or a field, measured the eggs of the saras and walked back, and there were 20 people waiting at my motorbike with sticks thinking that I was stealing the eggs. So that's the kind of bonding that they have forged, which is a function of not just the number of years they've lived there, but we suspect also to do with nuances like religion and the culture that they have. So we are hoping that, alluding to the last slide that Kerryn had, that we can continue to keep this landscape where people are doing well as farmers, where we have a burgeoning human population that does not seem to be really to the detriment of large species like cranes and also livestock. So we will be doing a lot more discoveries of this, and we will be starting interventions, because not all is hunky-dory, of course. There are some areas that we do need to intervene, like, for example, the new laws that are changing the kinds of pesticides that are being put in, the new laws that are changing the kind of farming that's being done. So we will need to start doing intervention, but at a fairly large level, it looks like, and not at the level of the farmer, which is sort of a breather, because imagine working with 230 million people. Thank you very much.
you have any initial idea of why the crane populations might be increasing in these areas? In other words, is it more food is available to them, or fewer predators, or do you have any idea what's going on?
And Gopi, can you repeat the question, please?
So the question was whether we had an idea of why the crane populations are beginning to increase. Is it higher food availability? Is it predators? I think it's a combination of all of them. So what seems to be happening is these areas are very strongly seasonal, and they have very good alluvial soil. So even though it's monsoonal, we have rain for 4 or 5 months if it's a normal monsoon, but the rainwater quickly disappears. It either goes to the groundwater because it's a massive aquifer there, it's almost a contiguous aquifer in the big, large area, and there's a huge amount of runoff, which is very, very important for our coastal fisheries industry. Now with rice coming in, along with rice, what comes in are things like irrigation structures like canals. They have other structures like small check dams and things like that that the farmers have started to have needed because they want to flood the rice in a particular way. So those are the things that have allowed the farmers to have a secondary crop like, say, wheat. Wheat is the crop that follows rice. And wheat cannot be fully flooded. Instead, wheat has a very interesting kind of watering that it requires. It needs what's called as pulsed flooding. So you need to flood it, let the water go away. And then flood again, let the water go away. And turns out, for the cranes and for the storks, it's perfect timing. They do the nesting when the rains are there and the whole area becomes a wetland. It's all rice, but it's still extremely wet. There's lots of crabs, there's lots of stuff to bring to their chicks. And when their chicks are ready to leave or starting to fledge, there's wheat. There's still that buffer of that landscape not being fully wet. And it's largely small-scale farming. I wouldn't call it subsistence farming because it's pretty intensive and that's all. It's not all that they do. And they also do multiple farming. And the farmers are fairly rich, not in a way that you and I would define richness. It's not about bank balances there, but it's about different cultural richnesses that they have. They have very strong connections with the land. They have very strong connections with cattle. They have extremely strong emotional connections with, we're finding out, with wetland structures and things like that. So there's, wealth for them is a very different thing. So it seems like it's not subsistence, but it seems to be that the flooding and the cropping pattern is aligned with the life cycle of the species that are living there, which is quite fascinating.
When you count the pairs that have 1 or 2 chicks, how old are the chicks when they're counted as 2?
So when we count the cranes with the chicks, how old are the chicks? So we do the counts throughout the year. So they monitor the whole landscape, each landscape that you saw the map of Nepal. So our field assistants monitor that entire region at least 4 times a year. And so we not just see them nesting and see the young chicks, but we also see them when they are fledged, which is when they're about 2 to 4 months old. And we only regard breeding success when the chicks have fledged, because just hatching cannot contribute to breeding success. So it's a very, very high resolution of information that is now beginning to feed into our population models that we are now also trying to interact with climate change models because monsoon is changing so much. And turns out, for good or for worse, bits of northern India are going to do pretty well given climate change. Most of South India is going to dry up, so my fear is that we'll get a lot of South Indians coming up north, which is going to increase the population that already exists. There's going to be a bit of sea level rises, but those sea level rises are going to impact countries like Bangladesh, whose population densities are about 1,800 people per square kilometer. And they are all going to come into the fertile Ganges. We are talking hopefully a couple of 100 years down the line, but those things are our biggest fears.
Well, I gather in this area of the world, you don't have a lot of dogs, unlike, say, South Africa. What is the tolerance between the cranes and the humans? And I think in this country, you see wild domestic dogs chasing cranes.
So are there many dogs in this area? There are a heck of a lot of dogs in the area. So we started to check on the dogs because of another species that I didn't talk about today, and that's the black-necked crane that's in Ladakh. So out of the last 4 breeding seasons, there has been 100% mortality of chicks for the last 3 years because of dogs for the black-necked cranes. Dogs are a very, very serious problem in India. And especially in the Gangetic Plains, we are now beginning to collect information. One of the government hospitals, government hospitals in India tend not to maintain the best of records. One of the government hospitals gave us records that showed that on average, they were getting 1,000 people coming in per month with dog bite reports. 1,000 people per month. And this is a government hospital. One hospital. So we think it's a problem of mega and epic proportions right now. And we've seen wild asses being taken down by dogs. We've seen sambar deer taken down by dogs. We've seen leopards being chased away from kills by dogs. So dogs are likely going to become the most important wildlife problem, much, much more than habitat loss and human beings in the very near future.
I was going to ask, what is the third crop in most years in this part of India? You said wheat and rice. Rapeseed?
No, we have potatoes between wheat and rice. And then after the wheat, just before the heat of the summer starts, they manage to grow a bunch of vegetables and fruits. And by heat of the summer, I mean 50 degrees centigrade.
What is that in Fahrenheit?
So that's the time that the villagers thought I was really potty.
Gopi, what is that in Fahrenheit?
Say again?
What's 50 degrees centigrade?
50 degrees. So 90 degrees Fahrenheit is 24 degrees centigrade.
Body
So
temperature?
Double that, yeah. Not double that, but yeah, whatever the formula.
I've heard it's 120 degrees.
So when that happens, when it reaches 40 degrees centigrade and 45 degrees centigrade, the sows, of course, have been there for a long time. They immediately find shade after feeding in the morning, and they're standing there panting the whole day. And the stupid ecologist is standing in the sun looking at them.
I love the getting to hear about ecologists.
We had a fun
More questions? Any questions for Kerryn also? Any more questions?
Thank you very much for coming out here.
Thank you.